Hello, thank you for opening this further recording. My name is Phil Doran and I'm taking you through some of the main points to consider when determining which Incoterms rule might apply to your sales model. This presentation is broken down into 4 short sessions, of which this is the third, and I remind you that the recordings are best understood if watched in sequence. So far we've covered the E and F prefixed terms. These two groups indicate that the seller is not responsible for the risk and cost of the international carriage or freight, the buyer is. But now we move on to those models where the seller pays the freight and builds this cost into their selling price. In this diagram, the seller's price ends somewhere in the buyer's country. This place or point may be the moment of arrival where the seller's price ends at the port or at the airport, for example. However, it may be any point from there up to and including the buyer's warehouse or works. Once more, this illustrates the importance of a correctly written rule giving a precise address or naming a place specifically. Before I continue, at this juncture we need to address an important and sometimes complex aspect of contracts. If we look at the supply chain, this black line on the diagram here, running from the seller to the buyer, we know that to utilize it, that is, to get the goods from A to B, there will be costs. Some of these costs will be borne by the buyer, some of them will be borne by the seller. We also know that simultaneous to the cost of this movement, there will be risks, some of which again will be carried by the seller and some of which will be carried by the buyer. But importantly, these are two different concepts. Cost and risk are not tied together, and in contracts they are frequently distributed independent of each other. Remember that delivery, that is to say the end of the contract, is that moment where risks pass from the seller to the buyer. Because risk and cost may be separated, risks may pass before the point where control of cost passes. Let me give you an example. Imagine that you are the seller. Your buyer has asked for a price from you. The price is to include the goods and the transport charges to an address in the buyer's country. The mode or method of transport is not important. You secure the business, create the cargo, and dispatch it to your client. Unfortunately, something goes wrong. The goods are lost or destroyed. The incident happens after you dispatch the goods and before your client has received the goods. What we do know is that the cargo will now never arrive. In this example, as the seller, what would you do next in your relationship with the buyer? Forgetting insurance, claims and counterclaims and just looking at the relationship you have with your buyer, then really you only have 2 choices. You could, at your cost and at no inconvenience to your client, recreate the cargo and replace the order. Whether you thereafter claimed on your insurance is not important in your relationship with the buyer. In the relationship you have with the buyer, you are bearing the loss. If this is your approach to the relationship, then you're selling the arrival of the contract goods. You believe that you have not met your contractual obligations to the buyer unless and until the goods arrive at the named place. Until the moment of arrival at the named place, the seller is bearing all costs and risks of transit. In Incoterm rules, you express this intention by using contract terms which begin with the letter D, and there are 3 of these in the current version of the Incoterms rules. We'll look at them shortly in part 4 of this overview. In a D prefix contract, contractual delivery is equal to physical delivery. But there is an alternative approach to this contract. As before, your price is to a named place in the buyer's country, and as before, something goes wrong and the cargo is lost or destroyed. This happens after dispatch and before arrival. In this second approach, the parties divide cost from risk, so that while the seller's cost ends at the named place in the buyer's country, the seller's risk in the journey ended in the country of supply at some point prior to the moment of export, potentially at the point of initial dispatch from the seller's works. In this type of contract, The seller is selling the dispatch of the goods. More precisely, the seller is selling documentation evidencing the dispatch of the goods with the transport charges prepaid. In Incoterms rules, although in this Incoterms and the ICC are only really following a long-established practice enshrined in most national laws, the seller expresses this intention by using contract terms which begin with the letter C, and there are 4 of these in the current version of the Incoterms rules. In a C prefix contract, the seller carries the cost of the supply chain to the point in the buyer's country, but it is the buyer who carries the risk of the transport decisions made by and paid for by the seller. In a C prefix contract, contractual delivery is equal to documentary delivery, that is to say, the handover of documentation by the seller to the buyer. Regardless of the location or status of the cargo in transit, documentary handover becomes the moment of delivery. You may recognize that there are classic bank instruments, the documentary credit, letter of credit or LC, that owe their existence to this principle of a documentary sale. The seller sells the buyer the hope of cargo, not the actual arrival of the underlying goods that the documents give hope to. 2 of these are very old terms, again predating Incoterms and requiring a very specific type of seaport operation, and 2 of the expressions are the multimodal modern equivalent of these old terms as drafted by the ICC. For a study of the background of these unique C prefix contracts, please refer to Module 5, and note too that a comparison of the D prefixed and C prefixed multimodal terms is investigated in Module 6. In summary then, how did we get here? We know the seller's price includes the freight, but this next question is the more complex one. Does the seller take the risk in transit as well as the cost? Yet, although the question is complex, the answer once again may only be a simple yes or no. If we select no, if we're confirming that although the seller has the cost of transit, the buyer bears the risk of arrival, then we need to contemplate the older and original sea freight version of these terms first. Just like FOB and FAS, these are terms used for sea freight only. They predate the creation of Incoterms, and they were designed to function in seaport operations where the seller had access to the loading of the vessel, that is, either to undertake the labour directly themselves or to take responsibility to supervise the loading operation. As with FOB, it hinges on the question of whether delivery is to take place on the loading of the vessel in the port of departure. Therefore, look to the port area. Is it restricted, or could the seller, under the right circumstances, be allowed direct access? The detail. Remember, it is always about the detail, so make sure first. Is the port area restricted? Yes or no? And bear in mind that most modern ports, particularly those handling containers, are restricted areas. But if you are satisfied that, in your circumstances, the seller has access to the vessel, then the answer to the question is yes, and the seller's last contractual act to achieve delivery is the risk and cost to load the vessel. There is then a further question around marine insurance cover. Does the seller procure insurance for the buyer? Yes or no? If the answer is no, then the model leans towards being a CFR contract. CFR represents the expression cost and freight, and is completed by the naming of the port to where the freight has been arranged to, and which is prepaid for by the seller. If, however, the seller must procure insurance for the buyer's risk, and the answer to the question is therefore yes, you are considering a CIF contract. This is cost, insurance, and freight. Again, naming the port in the buyer's country, and this time the seller must procure both the freight and the marine insurance cover through to that port. As I mentioned, This separation of risk and cost is a complex concept and one which goes back to customary practices developed in the European sea freight trades in the 18th and 19th centuries. These customary practices of separating risk from cost were eventually supported by the courts and became law in many countries. Risk passing on delivery, where delivery is the equivalent of loading the goods on board the vessel. The seller's control of costs, however, continues through to the potential destination port. Classically, these contracts were developed as cost and freight and cost insurance and freight, and they appear towards the very end of the Incoterm text as CFR and CIF. I am generalizing, but these contracts obligate the seller to sell the buyer conforming documents. As I said earlier, the seller sells the buyer the hope that the cargo arrives intact in the stated quantity, if indeed it arrives at all. The buyer throughout carries the risk of the seller's decisions. The modern traders, however, are generally not dealing with unrestricted ports, and their supply possibilities involve many different types of transport, including a more modern approach to sea freight. And so, we'll take a final break here and look at these multimodal contracts along with the alternative, that is, the multimodal D-prefixed arrival models, in far more detail in Part 4. This was Part 3 of which Incoterms rule to use. Thanks for listening so far.